Imagine you are standing at the edge of a small settlement on the southern alluvial plain of ancient Mesopotamia. The year is somewhere around 3900 BC. The air carries the thick, wet smell of the Euphrates in flood season, mixed with the acrid bite of burning dung used as fuel and the earthen musk of freshly worked mud brick. Around you, perhaps 200 or 300 people have built their lives in reed houses and low clay structures that seem to grow directly from the marsh. Children move between the buildings. A dog with visible ribs picks at refuse near a doorway. Somewhere in the settlement, behind a wall or beneath a canopy of woven reeds, someone is screaming. Not from injury, not from the pain of childbirth or the acute suffering of a wound. This is something else, a sound that rises and falls without the logic of physical pain, and a sound the people here recognize and fear and do not entirely understand. Because in this world, the boundary between illness of the body and illness of the spirit does not exist. There is no separation, and the person screaming is not simply sick. They are inhabited, they are afflicted, they are caught between the world of the living and something vast and invisible that the people of this era are only beginning to name. This is the world of the late Ubaid period, a civilization that stretched across southern Mesopotamia for nearly 2,000 years before the great surge of Uruk urbanization would transform everything. The people living here farmed barley and emmer wheat on the edges of the marshes, fished the slow rivers, herded cattle and goats, and built the earliest known temples to gods they believed actively shaped every moment of their existence. They did not yet have writing, they did not have bronze, but they had accumulated, across generations, an elaborate understanding of the invisible world, one in which every misfortune, including what we would today call mental illness, had a spiritual cause and demanded a spiritual response. Ancient Mesopotamian texts from the later Sumerian and Babylonian periods, many of them preserving traditions that scholars believe originated in precisely this era, describe a universe governed by divine forces that could be either protective or hostile, depending on circumstances of ritual, morality, and cosmic alignment. Alongside these divine forces existed a vast population of demons, entities the later Akkadian tradition would call Utuku or Galu, invisible beings capable of seizing a person's mind and driving them to madness, isolation, violence, or an unnatural stupor. The Book of Enoch, the apocryphal text preserved in the Ethiopian biblical canon and fragments recovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, speaks of a time before the Great Flood, when beings called the Watchers descended and unleashed forces into the world that humanity was not equipped to manage. Among those forces were spirits capable of afflicting the mind, corrupting the body, and turning human beings against themselves and their communities. Ancient texts describe these spirits as the offspring of the Watchers, incorporeal entities that wander the earth after the destruction of their physical forms, seeking hosts among the living. Whether these traditions describe a literal cosmological event or encode a cultural memory of something else entirely, the result in practical terms for people living in 3900 BC was the same. The experience we would today diagnose as psychosis, severe depression, epilepsy, or dissociative disorder was understood not as a dysfunction of the brain, but as a spiritual invasion, and the systems developed to address it were religious, ritual, and communal in nature. Let us try to understand what those systems actually looked like and what the daily experience of mental suffering meant in a world without psychiatry, without neuroscience, and without the concept of the individual mind as something separate from the cosmos. The person afflicted with what this culture recognized as madness occupied a profoundly ambiguous position in the social fabric of a late Ubaid settlement. Archaeological evidence from sites like Eridu and Tel El Ubaid shows us settlements organized around a central temple structure. With the religious specialist, the figure who would later be called the Ashipu, or incantation priest, likely occupying a position of significant social authority even at this early stage. We do not have written records from 3900 BC, but the continuity of material culture between the Ubaid period and the later Sumerian civilization suggests that the cosmological frameworks preserved in early Sumerian religious texts were already forming in precisely this era. What those later texts tell us is arresting in its detail. And the diagnostic handbooks of ancient Mesopotamia, the Sakiku series, describe in systematic terms dozens of conditions that map onto what we today recognize as psychiatric disorders. A person who laughs uncontrollably and cannot stop, who strips off their clothes and wanders the streets, who speaks to beings no one else can see, who lies in a stupor for days, unable to eat or move, who attacks family members without reason, who weeps without ceasing, who repeats the same words over and over until others cannot bear to be near them. Each condition had a name, a suspected divine or demonic cause, and a prescribed treatment. The texts themselves may have been compiled centuries or even millennia later, but the observations embedded in them reach back far beyond their inscription. In the settlement of 3900 BC, the afflicted person was rarely simply abandoned or cast out, though this sometimes happened in extreme cases. The first response was almost always communal. Family members gathered. Elders were consulted. The person displaying symptoms of what we might call acute psychosis, hearing voices, exhibiting paranoid terror, showing signs of what looks to modern eyes like a manic episode, would be brought before the settlement's ritual specialist. This figure performed a dual role that combined what we would today separate into the functions of priest and physician. They were diagnosticians of the invisible world, trained in reading the signs of demonic affliction and divine displeasure, and practitioners of a healing tradition that was simultaneously pharmacological, psychological, and spiritual. The diagnosis itself was a ceremony. The specialist examined the patient's body, observed their behavior, listened to their speech, and assessed the pattern of the affliction. When it had begun, whether it came in cycles, what seemed to provoke or calm it, whether the person had committed any ritual transgression that might have invited the affliction. This last question was not merely superstition. Embedded within it was a genuine clinical insight that behavior, social circumstance, and internal state were interconnected in ways that influenced health. The Ashipu was looking, in their own framework, for what we would call precipitating factors. Treatment began with ritual incantation. The spoken word was understood to carry ontological weight in this world. The power to reshape reality by addressing it directly. Incantations against demons, prayers to protective deities, verbal commands addressed to the afflicting spirit were not understood as symbolic gestures, but as actual interventions in the invisible fabric of the world. The patient was made to hear these words, often repeatedly, in sessions that could last hours. There is something that modern psychology would recognize here. The structured, repeated verbal interaction, the establishment of a calm, authoritative presence, the framing of the affliction as something that can be named, addressed, and eventually expelled. But the treatment was not only verbal. Herbal preparations were central to Mesopotamian healing, and the boundary between mental and physical illness was nowhere in the pharmacological tradition. Plants with documented sedative or anxiolytic properties, including preparations made from plants in the valerian family and various opium-adjacent botanical compounds that grew in the upland regions traded down to the alluvial plain, were used in combinations prescribed for what the texts describe as states of inner disturbance. The patient might inhale smoke from burning aromatic plants, drink prepared infusions, or have their body anointed with compound oils, while the ritual specialist continued the verbal component of treatment. Water played a central ritual role. Rivers were understood as living entities with divine affiliations, and in the cosmological framework of this era, immersion in or ritual washing with river water carried the power of purification that extended to the invisible dimension of the self. A person suffering from what looked like severe dissociation or psychosis might be walked to the river's edge and subjected to a careful, scripted cleansing ceremony designed to expel the afflicting presence through the medium of flowing water. Given what we know about the calming effects of sensory immersion and the genuine anxiety-regulating properties of cold water exposure, these practices were not without real physiological effect, even as their intended mechanism was entirely spiritual. The social management of severe mental illness in small settlements of this era raised questions that the community had to navigate practically and collectively. A person in the grip of what looked like acute mania, with its accompanying sleeplessness, grandiosity, and unpredictable aggression, supposed genuine risks in a settlement of 200 or 300 people living in close proximity with few physical barriers between dwellings. The evidence from later cuneiform texts suggests the use of physical restraint in extreme cases, not as punishment but as containment, sometimes described as a protective measure both for the patient and for the community. Family members bore primary responsibility for this care, a burden that must have been enormous in the context of lives already consumed by the daily labor of survival. What is striking, viewed from the distance of nearly 6,000 years, is how much of this system was built around the maintenance of the afflicted person's membership in the human community. The goal was not expulsion or permanent confinement, it was restoration, the return of the afflicted person to their proper place in the social fabric, understood as the displacement of the invading spirit and the re-establishment of the person's connection to their protective deity. This framing, whatever its theological premises, had real social consequences. It meant that the person's suffering was not primarily viewed as broken or worthless, but as temporarily occupied by something external, something that could, at least in principle, be removed. The affliction was not fundamentally them. There were limits to this framework. For conditions that persisted without remission, for those whose behavior was violent or chronically disruptive, the community's tolerance had edges that the evidence suggests were sometimes reached. Ancient texts describe individuals who were simply wanderers, figures moving between settlements without fixed community, unable to work or maintain relationships, surviving on the margins of agricultural society. Some of these figures acquired a strange secondary status as prophetic or liminal beings, persons whose disconnection from ordinary social life was reframed as proximity to the divine, as if the same opening that had let something destructive in might also channel something useful. The seer, the wandering prophet, the ecstatic figure who moved between worlds, was a recognized type in this culture. Feared, sometimes revered, never entirely at ease in the structured world of settlement and labor. The people of this era lived inside a worldview in which the membrane between the visible and invisible was thin and permeable everywhere. When the Book of Enoch describes the Watchers teaching humanity knowledge that was not meant for them, and the chaos that followed in its wake, including spirits that afflicted human minds with madness and sorrow, it is encoding in mythological language something that the people of 3900 BC experienced as simply true, that the world was full of forces that could enter a person and undo them, and that the preservation of the human mind required constant ritual vigilance, communal support, and the careful management of one's relationship to the invisible. Modern psychiatry has mapped the brain with astonishing precision and developed interventions, both pharmacological and cognitive, that would have looked like miracles to the ritual specialists of the Ubaid period. And yet, even in our era, the treatment of severe mental illness remains deeply shaped by social context, community response, and the quality of human presence in a person's life. The research is consistent. Isolation worsens outcomes. Community and meaningful connection improve them. The framework has changed almost beyond recognition, but the underlying truth that what breaks inside us often needs more than medication, that it needs to be witnessed, named, and held by others in relationship. That truth was already known to the incantation priest kneeling beside a suffering person in a reed settlement on the edge of the Euphrates, 5,000 years before the first modern clinic opened its doors. We do not know their names. We do not know how many of them recovered or what recovery looked like, or how many wandered away into the marshes and were lost. But they were there, and they were cared for in the only language their world offered. And that language, for all its strangeness, was not without wisdom. If you could stand in that settlement today, in the reed-fragrant dark, and hear the incantation rising in the night air,
Accept this offering.
you might recognize in it something you have heard before, in a different room, in a different century, but reaching for the same thing. A way to call a person back from wherever they have gone. If there is an era, a practice, or a mystery from the ancient world that you want us to explore next, leave it in the comments. We are always listening.